How did people in the
vapors.
Middle Ages
I feel
fake
so
their own
faint.
deaths? Hey everyone, tonight we're
Not
drifting
again.
back to a time when disappearing wasn't just difficult, it was practically impossible. No passports, no social media, no dental records, just you. A world that believed in witchcraft, and maybe a sack of questionable bread. So, how did anyone in the Middle Ages manage to fake their own death? It turns out, people were surprisingly creative when it came to not being dead. Before we settle into the story, go ahead and dim the lights. Let the room go quiet. Maybe you can hear the hum of a refrigerator. Or, if you're lucky, the soft creak of an old house pretending to be haunted. And as your breathing slows, we'll wander back to an age of monks, mischief, and a surprising number of people pretending to drown. Let's start with something important. The Middle Ages were not exactly known for accuracy. Chroniclers wrote about miracles, dragons, and saints who never technically existed. So, when someone died, or said they had, everyone sort of went with it. Documentation was, shall we say, optional. If you were a peasant, your death might not even make it into the local gossip. But if you were rich, or in debt, or inconveniently married, your death was a public affair, and therefore a performance. And like all good performances, some people really leaned into it. One of my personal favorites is William the Clerk, a 13th century Englishman who decided life as a monk just wasn't for him. Monastic life, as you might imagine, was not exactly thrilling. You woke up at 2 a.m. to pray. You copied Latin texts until your hand cramped. And if you sneezed too loudly during Mass, you probably had to fast for it. So William did what any man craving freedom would do. He faked his own death. Now, William's plan wasn't exactly subtle. According to records, he convinced a friend to claim his body had been found by the river. Because, of course, the river, medieval rivers, were practically full of conveniently dead people. The monastery held a solemn funeral. There were prayers. There was chanting. There were probably some monks thinking, finally, I can have his cell. And meanwhile, William was just living somewhere else, probably eating better bread and not waking up before dawn. Eventually, he was caught, of course. He returned to the monastery in disgrace, and the records suggest his punishment involved severe correction, which in monastic terms could mean anything from fasting to being hit with a wooden paddle shaped like divine justice. But William wasn't alone. In fact, fake deaths were a recurring theme in the Middle Ages because, and this will shock absolutely no one, medieval life was exhausting. Between taxes, disease, wars, and marriages arranged when you were 12, death sometimes looked like the most efficient form of self-care. Let's drift now to the 14th century, to the curious case of Eleanor Cobham. She was the Duchess of Gloucester, a woman of ambition, which in that era was just another way of saying, she's going to get into trouble. Eleanor was accused of dabbling in witchcraft and trying to predict the king's death, never a popular hobby. After her arrest, she was imprisoned in a series of castles, each one colder and damper than the last. But at one point, rumors spread that Eleanor had died in captivity. Conveniently, this rumor emerged right after she'd allegedly fallen ill. Some historians think she may have spread the rumor herself, hoping to slip away into obscurity. If she did, it didn't quite work. Officials went to verify her death, and, well, there she was, alive. Slightly disappointed, one imagines. There's something oddly endearing about these medieval fakers. They lived in a world obsessed with sin, salvation, and surveillance by priests, yet they still managed to invent their own escape routes. A sort of medieval witness protection program, without the protection part. And then there were the soldiers. Oh, the soldiers. In medieval warfare, fake death was practically a skill. If you fell in battle and stopped moving convincingly enough, you might actually live to see another day, assuming no one stepped on you. There are accounts from the 100 Years' War of men pretending to be corpses, waiting until nightfall, and quietly crawling off the field like guilty worms. Some never returned home at all, preferring to vanish entirely. They'd find another region, change their name, and start over. A new life, usually under a less prestigious but more breathable identity. But some stories are more intentional. Take John Holland, the Duke of Exeter. He lived in the late 1300s, a turbulent time even by medieval standards. John was a half-brother of King Richard II, which was both a blessing and a curse, mostly a curse. He was known for being violent, temperamental, and prone to making bad decisions. The medieval trifecta. At one point, he killed a man during a tournament. At another, he joined a rebellion, was caught, and sentenced to death. Yet for years afterward, rumors persisted that John hadn't really died, that he'd escaped, fled to Spain, and was living quietly under a false name. Because, of course, every era needs its conspiracy theories. There's no proof, naturally. But there never is, and that's part of what makes these stories linger. Medieval people didn't have cameras or gravestones with dates carved in marble. A death was as real as the story people told about it. Let's drift for a moment to the monasteries again, places where faking death was oddly common. When you joined a monastery, you were often required to die to the world, symbolically. But some took it a little more literally. There were monks who would vanish, leave a note implying divine rapture, and simply go farming somewhere else. One particularly imaginative friar claimed to have ascended to heaven, leaving behind a few suspicious footprints and a pile of robes. He was later found in a tavern several villages away, trying to trade blessings for beer. The church did not approve. The most ambitious cases, though, belong to royalty. Because when you're a monarch, death isn't just inconvenient, it's political, and sometimes suspiciously well-timed. Perhaps the most famous of these deaths was that of Emperor Frederick II, who ruled the Holy Roman Empire in the 13th century. Frederick was a strange, brilliant man, multilingual, fond of falcons, and known for arguing with popes as a hobby. When he died in 1250, not everyone believed it. The rumors began immediately. People claimed he'd merely gone into hiding, that he was waiting for the right moment to return, reclaim his empire, and restore order. In other words, the Middle Ages invented the Elvis is still alive theory centuries early. For nearly 300 years, imposters kept showing up, claiming to be Frederick. One even managed to gain followers before being unmasked, because, of course, there's always one man who thinks he can bring back an empire with good posture and a beard. The appeal of faking one's death in the E to Z Middle Ages wasn't just about escape, it was about transformation. You couldn't reinvent yourself by moving to another city or changing your username. You were who you were, forever, unless you died. So, people got creative. A knight tired of war might become a wandering hermit. A widow with debts might die and remarry in another village. A disgraced noble might disappear and live quietly under a saint's name. To the medieval mind, this wasn't always deceit. Sometimes it was rebirth. A chance to start over in a world that rarely allowed second chances. As we drift toward the end of this first part, it's worth pausing to imagine it. The candlelight, the cold stone walls, a world where the only proof of life or death was a rumor told by someone who may or may not have been sober, and in that quiet space between faith and fiction, a few clever souls decided to disappear. They left behind the noise, the taxes, the obligations, and maybe, just maybe, a few confused monks wondering where the body went. So, as the night deepens and your thoughts slow, let's keep wandering, because next we'll drift toward the ones who didn't fake their deaths. They just refused to die. The saints, the kings, and the immortals of rumor. But that comes in the next part. They involved humiliation, labor, ritual, and quiet monitoring, and they reflected, above all, a society deeply invested in controlling the unknown, the inexplicable, and the slightly awkward behaviors of men who were thought to flirt too closely with forbidden arts. So, as we imagine these men walking slowly through cobblestone streets, carrying heavy loads, wearing bells, or sitting quietly in cages while villagers whispered, we can sense the odd, low-energy rhythm of early modern justice. It was not about spectacle alone. It was about slow, careful assertion of order, of social hierarchy, and of communal reassurance. And the men, however unfortunate, endured. Some resisted, some adapted, and some simply survived, quietly bearing the peculiar burdens of accusation. And in that way, these stories resemble us tonight, lying quietly, aware of subtle restrictions, observing invisible rules, and pondering the gentle absurdities of life. The unusual punishments of male witches remind us that history is not always about dramatic heroics or tragic finales. Sometimes it is about small indignities, careful oversight, and the slow, persistent pressures of community. And there is, in that slow rhythm, a kind of hypnotic calm, a reminder that even the darkest fears of society are often expressed in the quietest, most measured ways. The quiet life of the hangman. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a rather uncomfortable corner of medieval life, somewhere between the gallows and the tavern, between duty and disgust, stood one of the loneliest figures in European history, the executioner. Now, I know, this might not sound like the most relaxing bedtime topic, but don't worry, we're not going to linger on the gore. We're going to explore the quieter, stranger parts of their lives, the long stretches between executions, when the axe was polished but idle, and the hangman had to somehow fill his day. So, if you're settled in, lights dimmed, maybe a blanket tucked just right, let's drift back to a world where public death was a civic event, and the man responsible for it couldn't sit with anyone at dinner. Executioners occupied a very particular social niche. They were essential, of course. Someone had to carry out the sentences that kings and councils passed down, but they were also despised. Their very touch was considered unlucky, contaminated, almost. In medieval Germany, the term was Scharfrichter, literally, sharp judge, and it's worth noting that the judge part of that title was not figurative. Executioners often performed not only beheadings but also minor judicial duties, overseeing punishments, torture sessions, even verifying confessions. They were the final stage of the justice system, which, in its infinite wisdom, often decided that the best way to prove someone guilty was to see how well they screamed. But here's the strange thing. Executions were not daily events. In many towns, months or even years could pass between them. So what did an executioner do when he wasn't executing? The short answer is, everything nobody else wanted to. Let's drift through a few of those duties. They cleaned the streets. They disposed of dead animals. They ran the town's tanneries, since handling rotting hides was considered appropriately disgusting work. In some cases, they even served as unofficial doctors, specializing, somewhat ironically, in wound care. Because if you spend your life learning how bodies come apart, you also learn, by necessity, a bit about how they hold together. In Nuremberg, records show that the town executioner in the 16th century, a man named Franz Schmidt, doubled as a sort of paramedic. He kept meticulous diaries, painfully neat, methodical, and in them he described performing hundreds of medical treatments. He pulled teeth, set bones, lanced abscesses, and treated infections. He also beheaded people on Tuesdays. Schmidt was unusual, though, in that he managed to maintain a veneer of respectability. He wrote with calm precision about his work, as though describing an accounting ledger. In his world, death was procedural, like paperwork with sharper edges. But for most executioners, life was messier, socially at least. They lived on the edges of towns, both literally and figuratively. The houses of executioners were often placed outside the city walls, usually near the gallows or the refuse pits. They couldn't shop in regular markets. They couldn't attend church with everyone else, and if they married, it was usually to the daughter of another executioner, because who else would have them? The profession became hereditary, not because of pride or prestige, but because nobody else wanted to take the job. Children of executioners grew up knowing that their career options were somewhat limited. There's a record from France of a man named Sanson. part of a long line of executioners who served for over a century. He once remarked that his family was as old as the monarchy itself, which, depending on your outlook, is either a point of pride or a very dark joke. The work paid well, though. That's one of the more surprising details. Executioners were often among the highest-paid public servants in town, which might explain why so many families held on to the position generation after generation. They received regular salaries, clothing allowances, and often the right to collect certain fees or goods from condemned prisoners. In some regions, they were even allowed to keep the clothes of the executed, a grim but practical perk, in an age when cloth was expensive and washing was optional. Still, for most of the year, the executioner had to keep himself busy. There were ropes to repair, blades to sharpen, and gallows to maintain. Public executions were performances, after all, and the props needed upkeep. Many also trained assistants, known, rather dramatically, as executioner's boys. These apprentices helped with the heavy lifting, carried messages, and learned the craft, one awful step at a time. But even with all that, the majority of their time was idle. So they turned to side hustles. Long before that phrase existed, some became knackers, disposing of dead livestock. Others brewed beer, distilled spirits, or ran small inns, mostly catering to travelers who didn't know any better. In some regions, executioners ran what were essentially medical practices, since their anatomical knowledge and access to materials gave them a certain edge over other healers. One 17th-century executioner in Bavaria was famous for making ointments that supposedly cured skin diseases. Though given his clientele, one suspects it was simply lard and bravado. It's tempting to imagine that these men lived in permanent isolation, but that's not entirely true. They had communities, just very selective ones. Executioners from neighboring towns often socialized with one another, forming loose networks that crossed borders and languages. They attended each other's weddings, traded tips about sword maintenance, and occasionally helped each other out when work got busy. Imagine, if you will, a guild of hangmen, equal parts grim and bureaucratic. In some cases, they even hosted their own fairs. At these events, executioners could meet, exchange medical knowledge, and perhaps most importantly, be around people who didn't recoil at their presence. So, while the executioner was a figure of fear to the public, he wasn't entirely alone. He existed in a shadow society of his peers, bound by profession, ostracized by everyone else. Let's drift now to another corner of this profession, the way it shaped families. Because when your father is the town executioner, your social life is, shall we say, complicated. Executioners' children were often forbidden from attending regular schools. They couldn't play with other children, and when they grew up, their marriage prospects were limited to others within their caste. But within those constraints, some families thrived. They formed dynasties of death, passing down the tools of the trade like sacred relics. Blades were named, maintained, and, in some cases, blessed. It's an odd inversion of chivalric lineage, where knights handed down swords of honor, executioners handed down swords of obligation, and yet these were families like any other. They had dinners, birthdays, and presumably small domestic arguments about whose turn it was to clean the execution sword. It's tempting to imagine medieval people simply dropping into bed after a long day of tilling, fields, or plotting dynastic revenge. But sleep wasn't a single, uninterrupted event like we know it today. In fact, it came in 2 acts. People in the Middle Ages often followed what's now called segmented sleep, 2 separate sleeps with a waking period in between. The first sleep usually started not long after sunset. Everyone went to bed once the hearth was banked and the fire burned low. This first sleep lasted about 4 hours. Then, sometime after midnight, people would quietly wake. Not fully, just enough to stir, stretch, maybe light a candle. This was called the watch, and it could last for an hour or 2 before they slipped back into their second sleep until dawn. Let's start with a small clarification. People in the Middle Ages did wash, just not often, and not in ways we'd recognize. There's a popular image of the medieval peasant as permanently coated in filth. Unwashed hair, grimy hands, and clothes stiff enough to stand on their own. That's only partly true. Most people did wash their hands and faces daily, usually in a basin of cold water. But full-body bathing? That was an event, something to be scheduled, much like a solar eclipse. For many, water was precious, heavy to carry, and often dubious in quality. Bathing meant heating it, hauling it, and finding somewhere private enough to do it. No small task when your house had 1 room, a dirt floor, and several curious chickens. Still, medieval people weren't entirely oblivious to hygiene. They understood that dirt could cause illness, though their reasoning was more spiritual than microbial. Cleanliness was next to godliness, in a very literal sense. To wash was to purify the soul as much as the body. Monks, for instance, were required to wash their hands before meals and their feet before bed, not for health, but for humility, and the rule of Saint Benedict, which guided monastic life, even prescribed regular bathing for the sick, though regular meant about once every few weeks. Let's drift for a moment into one of the more unexpected medieval luxuries, the bathhouse. Let's pause for a moment and reflect on how societies manage their uncomfortable necessities. Executioners remind us that civilization has always needed someone to do its dirty work, and has always pretended not to know them afterward. In every age, there are people whose jobs make others look away. The hangman's life, suspended between necessity and contempt, was a quiet tragedy. But in that quiet, he found routine, family, and even, occasionally, dignity. Now, in the next part, we'll drift deeper into what happened when these men tried to leave their profession. or when they became somehow famous, because history, in its strange humor, occasionally remembered them fondly. The quiet life begins, hey everyone, tonight. We're drifting back behind the convent walls to a world of silence, candlelight, and an almost alarming number of prayers. We're going to explore the hidden world of medieval nuns, what they did all day, what they did all night, and how an entire class of women managed to live their lives behind stone walls, wearing roughly the same outfit for decades, and somehow still getting into trouble. So, dim the lights, settle in, maybe light a candle if you're feeling the mood. Let's drift back to the medieval convent, the quietest place on earth, theoretically. Now, when you picture a medieval nun, you probably imagine serene devotion, hands folded, eyes heavenward, haloed by soft sunlight through stained glass. In reality, most convents were slightly chaotic mixtures of prayer, housework, and mild interpersonal resentment, like an eternal boarding school, but with more Latin. The day of a medieval nun was ruled, quite literally, by the bell. And the bell, like a slightly passive-aggressive roommate, dictated absolutely everything. When to wake, when to pray, when to eat, when to go to bed, even when to stop talking, which, in theory, was most of the time. The structure of their day was based on the divine office. 8 canonical hours of prayer spread across the day and night. It began before dawn, with matins, the first and longest service. Imagine the dark stillness of the pre-dawn chapel, the flicker of candlelight, and the sound of voices chanting in unison. Slow, steady, slightly out of tune, because they hadn't invented coffee yet. Then came lauds, praising the coming sunrise. Prime, around 6 in the morning. Terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline, rounding out the evening before bed. If that sounds like a lot of prayer, that's because it was, depending on the order. A nun might spend 6 or 7 hours a day just reciting psalms. And yes, they memorized hundreds of them. It was, in essence, a lifetime of chanting at precise intervals. If you ever think your office schedule is rigid, imagine living by bells that ring at 2 a.m. to tell you it's time to stand up and sing Psalm 63. After morning prayers, the day began properly. Breakfast, if you could call it that, might be bread soaked in watered wine, or perhaps some ale and cheese, if the convent was lucky. Then came labor, Because despite popular imagination, nuns didn't just float around praying all day. Every convent was a small, self-sustaining economy. Someone had to bake bread, mend clothes, garden, copy manuscripts, teach novices, and make sure the candles didn't all burn out at once. The choir nuns handled the spiritual work, the prayers, the singing, the copying of texts, while the lay sisters did the physical labor. Cleaning, cooking, laundry, and tending the animals. It was a division that occasionally caused mild tension. Choir nuns sometimes forgot that their cleaner companions were also technically brides of Christ, and not unpaid servants. Lay sisters, in turn, occasionally expressed their feelings through slightly excessive sweeping. Still, work was considered a form of devotion. Idleness is the enemy of the soul, the rule of Saint Benedict had warned. So there was always something to do. Gardens to tend, meals to prepare, manuscripts to illuminate. Some nuns became accomplished, scribes, one of the few professions available to women that didn't involve embroidery or strategic marriage. And speaking of embroidery, convents were textile powerhouses. They produced vestments, altar cloths, and delicate needlework for patrons who wanted something pious yet decorative. The irony, of course, was that the very vows that kept them isolated also made them useful. Wealthy families loved to commission work from nuns, because nothing said pure craftsmanship like a woman who literally couldn't leave the building. Now, between these tasks and the constant rotation of prayer, the day passed quietly, or so it seemed. Because for all the emphasis on peace, harmony, and chastity, convents were full of small dramas, petty rivalries over choir placement, disputes about whose turn it was to tend the garden, long-standing feuds about someone's tendency to hum off-key during compline. There are letters from medieval bishops essentially scolding nuns for being quarrelsome and uncharitable, which, translated from ecclesiastical Latin, means, "Please stop yelling in Latin." And then, of course, there was gossip, technically forbidden, but in practice, somewhat inevitable when you lived with the same 30 people for decades. Confessors often noted the most common sins among nuns were detractio, backbiting, and invidia, envy. So, even behind stone walls, human nature was doing what it always does, quietly undermining everyone's vow of silence. Let's drift over to one of the convent's more curious aspects, how women became nuns in the first place. Some, of course, were genuinely devout. They wanted to dedicate their lives to prayer and contemplation, but many others were there because of family decisions. Dowry could place one daughter in a convent just as easily as another in marriage, and for noble families with too many daughters, the convent was a respectable solution to the arithmetic of inheritance. Once inside, the process was formal. A girl would take her vows: poverty, chastity, obedience, and become the symbolic bride of Christ. There was even a ritual wedding ceremony, complete with ring and veil, a solemn reminder that she had, in effect, married a divine being with no particular interest in domestic life. Her worldly clothes were removed. Her hair was cut, sometimes completely, and she received the habit of her order. It was meant to symbolize renunciation of vanity. It also made it somewhat easier to identify her in the event she ever tried to escape. The vows were lifelong, though occasionally negotiable. Convents sometimes found themselves housing unwilling nuns who had been forced into religious life for convenience's sake. Bishops occasionally received letters from women begging to be released from their vows, citing lack of vocation, which, roughly translated, means "I've changed my mind." A few convents were notorious for their relaxed interpretation of discipline. Records mention nuns sneaking out to attend fairs, owning pets, strictly forbidden, and even keeping small dogs hidden in their sleeves during prayer. Because, of course they did. They were human, deeply pious humans, with a surprising number of illicit terriers. Meals were another cornerstone of convent life, though not necessarily an enjoyable one. Food was simple and largely vegetarian. The rule of Saint Benedict forbade the eating of meat from four-legged animals, except in cases of illness, so the menu leaned heavily toward fish, eggs, cheese, and vegetables. On fasting days, which were frequent, meals might consist of bread and water. And yet, there are charming records of small rebellions. One abbess in the 14th century was reprimanded for allowing her nuns to drink too much wine during Lent. Another was accused of hoarding butter. Apparently, the temptation of dairy products was the monastic equivalent of sin. After the midday meal, there was time for reading, contemplation, or writing letters. Convents were centers of literacy for women, and some nuns became respected theologians, mystics, or poets. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, one of the most extraordinary minds of the 12th century, composed music, wrote natural philosophy, and claimed divine visions so detailed that modern scholars suspect migraines were involved. She wrote letters to emperors, advised bishops, and somehow still managed to maintain a functioning convent. A true overachiever in a world where most women weren't allowed to write their own names. But for every Hildegard, there were dozens of quiet, anonymous sisters who spent their entire lives copying psalms or tending herb gardens. Steady, unremarkable devotion that made up the rhythm of the medieval church. They didn't leave great works, but their labor kept the entire structure running, like quiet gears in a divine machine. As evening came, the bell called them again. Vespers, then supper, another modest meal. Finally, Compline, the night prayer, the chant of the Nunc Dimittis. Now, Lord, let your servant depart in peace. Soft voices echoing in the half-dark, fading into stillness. After that came the great silence. No talking until morning, no movement except what was absolutely necessary. Each nun retreated to her cell, or, in some convents, to shared dormitories with thin partitions, a small straw mattress, a rough wool blanket, a single candle, if you were lucky, and then darkness, the sound of breathing, the faint rustle of linen, the quiet hum of an entire building, drifting into prayerful sleep. It's hard not to feel a certain peace in imagining it, the calm of complete simplicity, the same prayers, the same walls, the same bed, night after night, until death. Monotony raised to the level of holiness. Of course, the peace didn't last long. A few hours after midnight, the bell rang again. It was time for matins, the midnight office. The sisters rose, shivering in the cold, lit their candles, and shuffled to the chapel. There, in the half-dark, they sang once more, voices thin with sleep, weaving into the stone, rising toward the rafters like pale smoke. The restless night begins. Hey, everyone, tonight, we're drifting back to the medieval night, a time before glowing screens, before alarm clocks, and before the luxury of pretending you didn't hear the rooster. We're going to explore something we all do, but they did very differently. Sleeping, or more accurately, how medieval people actually slept. Because as it turns out, they weren't just collapsing into hay and snoring until sunrise. Their nights were layered, interrupted, and, surprisingly, social affairs, full of small rituals, half-lit rooms, and the quiet sounds of the world long before insulation was invented. So, dim the lights, Get comfortable. Maybe, if you're feeling authentic, imagine the faint smell of smoke and tallow candles, a creaking wooden bed frame, and the sound of rain dripping through a thatch roof. Let's drift back to a night in the Middle Ages. It's tempting to imagine medieval people simply dropping into bed after a long day of tilling fields or plotting dynastic revenge. But sleep wasn't a single, uninterrupted event like we know it today. In fact, it came in two acts. People in the Middle Ages often followed what's now called segmented sleep, two separate sleeps, with a waking period in between. The first sleep usually started not long after sunset. Everyone went to bed once the hearth was banked and the fire burned low. This torture. First sleep lasted about 4 hours. Then, sometime after midnight, people would quietly wake. Not fully, just enough to stir, stretch, maybe light a candle. This was called the watch, and it could last for an hour or two before they slipped back into their second sleep until dawn. It sounds odd to us now, but it made perfect sense in a world where nights were long, winters longer, and entertainment options rather limited. The night was a kind of slow breathing. Sleep, wake, sleep again, like the rhythm of a body in sync with the darkness. During that middle interval, people did, well, all sorts of things. Some prayed, some talked quietly with their spouses. Monks used the time for their night offices, those sleepy chants echoing in stone cloisters. Others might mend clothes, tend a fire, or even visit neighbors. The night watch wasn't sinister. It was just another kind of time, a calm interlude before the second dream. And yes, sometimes it was used for less pious activities. Church writers of the time were deeply concerned that the watch was when sin tended to happen. Apparently, the combination of darkness, boredom, and free time made people creative. Still, this rhythm was entirely normal. People even described dreams differently depending on which sleep they came from. The first sleep's dreams were often thought to be false, while those that arrived in the second were considered truer, closer to morning revelation. If you woke from your second sleep with an idea, it might even be treated as divinely inspired, which was convenient if you happened to have a bright idea like, "Let's invade France again." But before we get too deep into dream interpretation, let's look at where medieval people actually slept. Because the image we have, a simple straw pallet on the floor, is both true and not for peasants. Yes, it was often that simple. A low wooden frame, or just a pile of straw, reeds, or wool rags stuffed into a sack. The word mattress, by the way, comes from Arabic, matra, meaning something thrown down, which, in this case, was extremely literal. The wealthy, on the other hand, took sleeping rather seriously. Beds were among the most valuable pieces of furniture in any household. They were made of carved oak or walnut, with curtains that could be drawn for warmth and privacy. Feather mattresses, linen sheets, embroidered coverlets, even cushions filled with down. In noble homes, beds weren't just for sleeping, they were status objects. People gave them as wedding gifts, willed them to heirs, and even received visitors while reclining in them, which must have made awkward conversation even more so. There's a famous medieval scene in which a visiting noble comes to speak with a lady, and she remains sitting up in bed, while servants stand around holding candles. It wasn't considered improper, just deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. Of course, not everyone had a bed to themselves. In fact, most didn't. Sleeping was a communal experience. Whole families often shared one bed. Parents, children, maybe a servant or two if space was tight. Travelers might share with strangers at inns, which sounds horrifying to us, but was simply practical then. In the dark, on cold nights, body heat was precious. The bed was a shared hearth, and people's sense of privacy was considerably more relaxed than ours. Records from England describe entire households sleeping in one room, the lord and lady on a raised bed, servants on pallets nearby, and sometimes livestock in the corner for warmth. Chickens were apparently common bedroom companions, though one imagines they were not especially restful. Now, let's drift over to what medieval people wore to bed, because surprisingly, night clothes weren't really a thing for most of the Middle Ages. Ordinary folk often slept naked or in their regular undergarments, not out of scandalous intent. It was just simpler that way. Clothes were expensive, and wearing them at night would wear them out faster. It wasn't until the later centuries that nightshirts and caps became common. The classic nightcap, by the way, was genuinely useful, not a joke from Christmas stories. Rooms were unheated, drafts plentiful, and hair held warmth. So a little linen cap could make the difference between comfort and waking up half frozen. And speaking of cold, medieval beds had their own technology for that. People used warmed stones, metal pans filled with embers and even heated bricks wrapped in cloth to keep their sheets toasty. Though, occasionally, one imagines this led to smoldering regrets. Let's talk about light, or rather, the lack of it. Once night fell, darkness was nearly absolute. Candles were costly, and rushlights, those thin strips of reed soaked in tallow, burned quickly and smelled like rancid meat. So most people simply went to bed soon after sunset, because there wasn't much else to do that didn't involve tripping over furniture. In wealthy homes, a servant might tend a candle through the night, or a chamber might have a single oil lamp. The glow of the hearth provided a low, pulsing comfort, flickering light that made the shadows dance gently on the walls. Imagine lying there, half asleep, listening to the wind sigh through the shutters, the faint hiss of the fire settling into ash. For a world without electric light, night wasn't silent, but it was profoundly still. In monasteries, things were more regimented. Monks and nuns followed strict sleeping routines, often getting up at set hours for prayer. The night was divided not by hours, but by bells. A bell for complain, signaling it was time to lie down. A bell for matins, dragging them back up again. Then another for lauds, welcoming the dawn. It's safe to say that monks never experienced what we'd call a full night's sleep, though they probably became experts at short naps during sermons. Their dormitories were long, cold halls with rows of narrow beds or simple pallets separated by thin partitions. Some monasteries allowed no partitions at all, believing privacy encouraged sin, which sounds like the reasoning of someone who has never shared a room with 30 men who snore. Still, the discipline of sleep was spiritual. To rest too deeply was to indulge the flesh. And so the monastic night was a kind of endurance test. Sleep in moderation, pray frequently, and don't get too comfortable. But outside the cloister, sleep was more elastic. It bent with the seasons. In winter, people slept long and often. In summer, they rose early to catch the cool of the morning. The rhythms of life were shaped by daylight and necessity, not by clocks, and there's something almost enviable about that. When the sun went down, the world simply slowed. The day didn't end. It dissolved. Work stopped. Talk faded, and the night stretched out like a quiet invitation to rest. It's easy to forget that for most of history, sleep wasn't something squeezed between obligations. It was an event, a pause the whole world seemed to participate in. Even the animals followed it. dogs curled by the hearth, horses stood drowsing in the dark, and outside, owls took up their soft sentry duty. A medieval night wasn't peaceful in the modern sense, but it had its own serenity, a kind of rough-edged calm, punctuated by the crackle of wood and the occasional drunk song drifting from the tavern. Let's pause there, at the edge of that candle-lit room. The fire is low. The air smells faintly of wool and smoke. A man turns in his bed, mutters something about tomorrow's weather, and sinks into his second sleep. Outside, the moon is a cold coin in the sky. The streets are empty, but for a dog sniffing its way through the refuse. In a distant tower, a monk's bell tolls softly. It's midnight in the Middle Ages, the true center of night. And while the rest of the world dreams, the watchful few tend fires, whisper prayers, or simply sit awake, waiting for morning. In the next part, we'll drift a little deeper into how dreams, medicine, and even superstition shaped the medieval night. Because for people of that age, sleep wasn't just rest, it was a doorway. And like most medieval doorways, it sometimes led somewhere unnerving. A world without soap operas, but plenty of soap problems. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when the streets were muddy. The air smelled faintly of smoke and livestock, and personal hygiene was negotiable. This evening's topic is one that tends to make modern people wrinkle their noses and thank the heavens for plumbing. Because tonight, we're talking about cleanliness, or rather, the remarkable medieval lack thereof. The question is simple. How dirty was medieval Europe really? The answer, as with most historical questions, is it depends, mostly on where you lived, how much money you had, and whether your nearest water source was also your local waste disposal system. So, if you're cozy under the blanket and you've brushed your teeth, a luxury few medieval peasants ever experienced, let's drift back to a world where clean was more a spiritual concept than a physical one. Let's start with a small clarification. People in the Middle Ages did wash, just not often, and not in ways we'd recognize. There's a popular image of the medieval peasant as permanently coated in filth. Unwashed hair, grimy hands, and clothes stiff enough to stand on their own. That's only partly true. Most people did wash their hands and faces daily, usually in a basin of cold water. But full-body bathing? That was an event, something to be scheduled, much like a solar eclipse. For many, water was precious, heavy to carry, and often dubious in quality. Bathing meant heating it, hauling it, and finding somewhere private enough to do it. No small task when your house had one room, a dirt floor, and several curious chickens. Still, medieval people weren't entirely oblivious to hygiene. They understood that dirt could cause illness, though their reasoning was more spiritual than microbial. Cleanliness was next to godliness. In a very literal sense, to wash was to purify the soul as much as the body. Monks, for instance, were required to wash their hands before meals and their feet before bed. Not for health, but for humility, and the rule of Saint Benedict, which guided monastic life, even prescribed regular bathing for the sick. Though regular meant about once every few weeks. Let's drift for a moment into one of the more unexpected medieval luxuries, the bathhouse. Because despite the era's reputation, Europe actually went through a brief golden age of bathing, roughly from the 12th to the early 15th centuries. Cities like Paris, London, and Nuremberg were dotted with public bathhouses. They were often built near rivers, heated by wood fires, and filled with steam thick enough to hide the questionable behavior within. Bathhouses weren't just for washing. They were social hubs. People came to relax, gossip, eat, drink, and, increasingly, engage in activities that had very little to do with hygiene. Chroniclers grumbled that bathhouses had become dens of sin, which, given human nature, is probably accurate. Still, for a few centuries, urban Europeans were cleaner than their later Renaissance descendants would be. A typical bathhouse might have tubs lined with linen sheets, scented water infused with herbs, and attendants who refilled the buckets. You could order food while you soaked. Couples often bathed together. Some even brought musicians. So, yes, for a brief, shining moment, bathing was downright fashionable, until, inevitably, it wasn't. By the 16th century, the bathhouse had fallen out of favor, partly due to moral panic. The church frowned upon mixed bathing, and partly due to plague. When the Black Death rolled across Europe, people began to suspect that hot water opened the pores and let disease seep in. Doctors advised against bathing, too. Frequently, better to let the skin form a protective layer, which is an elegant way of saying a film of grime thick enough to repel fleas. So, public bathing declined, private washing became minimal, and for the next few centuries, Europeans would achieve a level of aromatic intensity that's difficult to imagine without air conditioning. Even monarchs weren't immune. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, supposedly took only a handful of baths in his entire life. though he did change his linens frequently, which, in his mind, achieved roughly the same result. The logic was simple. If you smelled of lavender and powder, no one would notice that you hadn't touched water in months. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back in the earlier medieval period, say the 12th or 13th centuries, the average person wasn't wallowing in filth. They just had a different relationship with dirt. Peasants, who worked outdoors, were perpetually dusty, but they also spent a lot of time near rivers and wells, washing clothes, bodies, and tools often happened at the same place. The same river that provided water for bread making also carried away animals. Effectively, a medieval cycle of out of sight, out of mind. Soap existed, though it was rough, brown, and smelled faintly of goat, made from animal fat and lye. It worked well enough, but it wasn't something everyone used. Laundry was washed more often than bodies, partly because wearing clean linen next to the skin was thought to absorb dirt. In other words, if your shirt was clean, you were clean by association. It's oddly charming logic, and, in fairness, linen does absorb oils. So, changing your shirt was genuinely a form of hygiene, not a particularly effective one. But still, let's wander for a moment into a medieval city. It's early morning in, say, 14th century London. The streets are narrow, cobbled in theory, but mostly mud in practice. Water drains poorly, when it drains at all, and sanitation. Well, sanitation is a strong word. Every house has a chamber pot, and when that chamber pot is full, it is emptied somewhere, usually into the gutter, sometimes out the window, with or without the traditional warning cry of "Gardez l'eau," watch out for the water, a euphemism that, we must admit, doesn't quite capture the situation. But that was life. Waste ran down the streets, mixing with animal droppings and kitchen refuse. The smell was, as one chronicler put it, abominable and great. Yet people adapted. You'd simply avoid stepping in puddles that shimmered for the wrong reasons. Medieval towns did have rudimentary sanitation systems. Larger cities had street cleaners or rakers paid to remove refuse and dung. Some had open sewers, basically trenches lined with stone that carried waste out of the walls. Others had latrines that emptied into cesspits. Cesspits, of course, had to be emptied by hand. This was the work of gong farmers, an actual profession, paid well but shunned by polite society. They worked by night, waist-deep in sewage, scraping and shoveling with stoic despair. Truly, if there's ever been a job less appreciated, it's hard to imagine it. And yet, these same cities often had beautiful public fountains and wells. Clean water and filth existed side by side. A neat metaphor for the entire medieval condition. Now, if you were wealthy, your relationship with hygiene was slightly better, or at least more perfumed. Nobles had private chambers with basins and ewers for washing hands and faces. Some had wooden tubs lined with linen sheets, brought into their rooms for bathing on special occasions. Servants would pour warm water from jugs, refill it as it cooled, and sometimes scent it with rose petals or thyme. It sounds idyllic, until you remember that your bathroom was still your bedroom, and the water was reused by multiple family members. Still, the idea of luxury bathing never entirely vanished from the upper classes. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine reportedly enjoyed herbal baths, and Henry III of England once ordered a new bathtub made of oak to be lined with cloth and placed near the fireplace. It's possible he spent more time constructing the tub than actually using it, because even for nobles, frequent bathing was considered unnecessary or even dangerous. The belief was that water softened the flesh, making one susceptible to illness. The best solution, then, was to avoid water altogether and let divine protection handle the microbes. Of course, what people lacked in soap, they made up for in scent, perfumes, pomanders, and herbs were everywhere. People wore small sachets of dried lavender or cloves around their necks. They sprinkled rose water on their hands, burned incense in rooms, and hung bundles of herbs to purify the air, which again was less about cleanliness and more about masking the reality of shared humanity. In churches, the incense did double duty, sanctifying the air and concealing the odor of hundreds of unwashed pilgrims. You could almost call it divine deodorant. Let's not forget clothing, the great equalizer of cleanliness. Linen shirts, as we mentioned, were prized for their ability to absorb oils and sweat. But outer garments, wool, leather, or heavy cloth, were rarely washed. They were brushed, beaten, and occasionally aired out. But water was kept far away from them. Even armor smelled. Knights, encased in steel, often wore padded garments underneath that absorbed every drop of sweat, and never, ever saw soap. A battlefield in summer, therefore, was both a military and olfactory experience. We should pause here to remember that not everyone accepted this state of affairs. There were exceptions. little oases of cleanliness amid the grime. Let's leave it there for tonight. Among the faintly smoky, earthy air of medieval Europe, somewhere a bell tolls. A woman fills a basin with cold water, rinses her hands, and calls it a bath. A monk hums a psalm while washing his feet in a wooden bowl. And in the distance, the bathhouse glows with candlelight, laughter, and the sound of splashing. The night air smells of wood smoke and rosemary, and the world, for all its dirt, feels alive. The quiet days of medieval nurses. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a quieter, softer corner of the past. A place rarely spoken of with any drama, yet full of tiny, oddly human stories. Imagine a dimly lit hospital ward in the late medieval period. The candles flicker, the air is faintly scented with herbs, and there's a soft shuffle of footsteps across stone floors. Not the kind of place you'd think of for grand battles or heroic deeds. Instead, it's a place of waiting, of small gestures, of quiet vigilance. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with the people who filled these spaces. Nurses, or as they were sometimes called, sisters, attendants, or women of care. Now, the first thing to understand is that medieval hospitals were not at all like the bustling modern emergency rooms we imagine. They were small, sometimes crude, often underfunded, and for long stretches of time, especially when there were no plagues, or when the plague had mercifully receded, these hospitals were remarkably calm. Very few patients meant very little to do, at least on the surface. But that doesn't mean the nurses were idle. Not quite. They found ways to fill their days, with activities both practical and peculiar, because humans are, after all, not built for too much quiet without inventing something to occupy the hours. So, what did these nurses actually do? Well, let's begin with the most mundane but surprisingly time-consuming duties. Cleaning. It sounds dull, because it is. But stone floors in a medieval ward had a way of collecting every imaginable bit of dust, straw, and sometimes worse. Scrubbing, sweeping, and reorganizing could take hours. And naturally, in the absence of patience, there was a strange kind of pride in having a sparkling ward. Some nurses became quite competitive about it, though they would never admit it out loud. They would wander the corridors, broom in hand, giving each other tiny, sideways glances, as if to silently declare, "Yes, I have conquered the dust of the East Wing again today." Then there was the laundry, which was a bigger deal than it might seem. Bedding, clothing, even small tapestries that decorated the more modest wards all needed attention. In large hospitals, there might be a small team dedicated entirely to this. But in smaller establishments, nurses handled it themselves. They would pound the linens in tubs, rinse, wring, and hang them across gardens or courtyards. It was a rhythmical, almost hypnotic task, one that could easily fill the morning and leave the afternoon free for other things. And what were those other things? Often reading, needlework, or prayer. Not all nurses were literate, of course, but those who were would spend long stretches copying texts, mostly religious, sometimes medical. Illuminated manuscripts were rare, but a careful hand could make even a simple prayer book beautiful. Needlework was another common pastime. Mending, embroidering, or even creating tiny personal projects. And naturally, when the hands were busy with repetitive motions, the mind wandered. Rumor and gossip circulated in hushed tones, not out of malice, but because news traveled slowly. And storytelling was, in a sense, a sport. Some nurses even became unofficial chroniclers of their wards, jotting down minor illnesses, the odd visitor, or the peculiar behavior of a wealthy patient who happened to pass through. It might surprise modern listeners to learn that many nurses had a kind of unofficial authority in their quiet hours. Without the chaos of an outbreak, they could experiment with new herbal remedies, test the strength of poultices, or simply rearrange the storage of supplies. And of course, there was supervision. Hospitals were hierarchical, even in their calmest days, so senior nurses often spent time mentoring novices, correcting small errors, or quietly judging the ways in which others carried out their duties. It was an environment of understated control, punctuated by the occasional sigh or whispered complaint. And yet, despite all the routine, the absence of plague didn't mean the absence of drama. Human beings have a way of creating it, even in the gentlest of circumstances. Rivalries developed over trivial matters. Who could fold the cleanest sheets? Who brewed the most effective herbal teas? Or who could walk the halls with the least creak in their wooden clogs? Some nurses became legendary for their meticulous care, while others were remembered for being less careful. A mislaid bandage could result in weeks of teasing or quiet resentment. And naturally, the hospital governors sometimes interfered, making arbitrary decisions about room assignments, duties, or privileges, which caused tiny ripples of irritation among the staff. Of course, not all activities were strictly practical. There was storytelling, both factual and fanciful. Nurses would pass long afternoons recounting the minor scandals of local nobility, embellishing as needed. Children sometimes wandered into the hospital courtyards, and nurses entertained them with quiet games, simple songs, or improvised toys. Some hospitals even kept small gardens, where the nurses would cultivate herbs for their remedies, flowers for the chapel, or vegetables for the modest meals of staff and patients. These gardens were not merely decorative. They were an opportunity for quiet contemplation and for minor triumphs when a stubborn crop finally grew against all odds. And speaking of meals, we should consider how the nurses spent their time around food. Meal preparation in medieval hospitals was a communal and often repetitive affair, especially in larger establishments. Staff would peel vegetables, tend small fires, and occasionally taste the concoctions to ensure they weren't, in fact, poisonous. Once the work was done, there was usually a moment of respite, a simple meal shared quietly, with conversation that drifted lazily from one topic to another. And when the meal was over, there was always the next chore waiting. Whether it was tending to the stores of grain, replenishing candles, or inspecting the few remaining patients for subtle signs of illness. Yet perhaps the most curious pastime of nurses in quiet periods was observation. They watched the passage of time in microcosms. They noted how a candle burned, how a bird perched on a nearby windowsill, how the seasons shifted through the thin panes of glass. Some historians suggest that these women, often overlooked in grand historical narratives, had an acute sense of patience and attention, honed by hours of waiting and gentle vigilance. It was not glamorous work, but it was work that shaped lives, subtly and profoundly. And of course, there was reflection. Long stretches without urgent crises allowed for private thought, contemplation of personal circumstances, and sometimes subtle ambitions. Nurses might quietly aspire to senior positions, keep small journals, or simply enjoy the rare luxury of an uninterrupted afternoon. They were rarely remembered in grand histories, but in these quiet corridors they lived full and intricate lives, punctuated by minor triumphs, fleeting irritations, and the gentle passage of time. We can even glimpse, occasionally, the humor that threaded through their days. A clumsy apprentice spilling a bucket of water, a candle tipping over and sending a small plume of smoke into a corner, or the endless debate over the proper way to fold a sheet. All these moments were quietly entertaining in a low-energy sort of way, and naturally these minor mishaps were remembered with affectionate teasing, not harsh punishment, because, in the absence of plagues or emergencies, patience reigned supreme. Let's drift over to the next subtle layer of their daily existence: care for the sick, when they did arrive. Even during quiet times, patients trickled in, usually older, poorer, or slightly less fortunate folk, who wandered into hospitals seeking warmth, food, or minor remedies. Nurses attended to them with consistent, gentle routine. They measured pulses as best they could, prepared simple treatments, and provided comfort. Their touch was often the only consistent kindness a patient might encounter, and in the gaps between these minor duties, they returned to their quiet rhythms, sweeping, mending, and observing. And so, the life of a medieval nurse in calm times was not dramatic, not flashy, but oddly rich. It was the accumulation of small gestures, gentle humor, careful attention, and soft observation. It was the quiet interplay of duty and idleness, responsibility and reflection. And if we imagine ourselves in their shoes, walking softly across stone floors, hearing the occasional murmur of a colleague or the distant clatter of a kitchen, we might feel a kind of calm curiosity, a sense that even in the most mundane corners of history, life was quietly full. And in that way, the nurses of the medieval world were not unlike us tonight, listening to the soft ticking of time, waiting for sleep, and finding meaning in small, simple acts. Their world was slow, deliberate, and sometimes oddly satisfying, a reminder that history is not always about battles or kings, but often about the quiet care that allows life to continue, unnoticed and uncelebrated. Let's drift, finally, to the medieval idea of smell. Because in a world without soap, smell was not a sign of shame. It was part of existence. A person's scent was a signature, their aura. The smell of sweat and earth was natural, even healthy. The poor smelled of labor, the rich of perfume and musk, and everyone smelled faintly of smoke. It was the scent of life. It's easy to laugh now, imagining a medieval street with its layers of odor. But perhaps, in that dense atmosphere, people felt connected to their work, their homes, their neighbors. After all, when everyone smells the same, no one stands out, and there's a kind of equality in that. Queens behind closed doors. Hey, everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a world of heavy gowns, cold stone walls, and the subtle yet persistent scent of paranoia. A world where being born into royalty did not guarantee freedom, comfort, or even basic happiness. In fact, sometimes it guaranteed quite the opposite. Tonight, we're going to explore the lives of queens who were imprisoned by their own families, not by enemies, not by invading armies, but by the very people who were supposed to protect and cherish them. Now, let's start gently, with the realization that this was not always dramatic, loud, or violent. Royal imprisonment often came in forms that were quiet, slow, and deeply bureaucratic. A locked door here, a forbidden corridor there, a small, well-guarded chamber in the corner of a palace. Meals were delivered, servants were present, but the sense of personal freedom, what little a queen could hope for, was stripped away. And naturally the reasons were often petty, political, or unimaginably awkward. Take, for instance, Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England in the mid-15th century. She was married to Henry VI, a king whose temperament was delicate and, shall we say, unusually prone to melancholy. Margaret herself was ambitious, clever, and often frustrated by the limits imposed upon her as a queen consort. When civil war, later called the Wars of the Roses, erupted, she found herself on the losing side more than once. But even before the battles, she faced a kind of domestic containment. She was effectively imprisoned in various royal residences when political circumstances made her a liability. Not a dramatic dungeon, mind you, but a suite of rooms with guards subtly placed at doors, and courtiers who watched her every move. Margaret's confinement was a study in quiet tension. She could move, she could speak, but every word, every step, was monitored gently with bureaucratic precision. And then there was Mary, Queen of Scots, whose life is one long, slow sigh of confinement. Now, Mary's story is more widely known, so we'll tiptoe through it gently. She was imprisoned for nearly 2 decades, first by her own cousin, Elizabeth I of England, and before that, she faced restrictions imposed by her own family in Scotland, particularly after her controversial marriages. But it's worth noting that her confinement was often as social as it was physical. Her chambers were lavish, her meals delicate, and she had servants and companions, yet she was constantly monitored. Letters were read, messages intercepted, visitors carefully screened. The imprisonment of queens often combined discomfort with quiet psychological pressure. They could see the world, they could be served, yet they were deeply, inescapably isolated. And sometimes the reasons were remarkably petty. Let's drift over to the Spanish court, where Juana of Castile, later known as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad, spent much of her adult life under a form of familial imprisonment. Now, she wasn't imprisoned because she had committed a crime, at least not in the conventional sense. Her father, Ferdinand, and later her son, Charles, deemed her mentally unstable. Historians suggest she may have suffered from severe depression, obsessive grief, or perhaps something more medically nuanced. But the label of madness was enough. Her confinement was relatively gentle. She was provided with attendants, her rooms were ornate, and yet she could not rule freely, marry freely, or even travel without supervision. Her family, after all, was convinced that they alone could manage her erratic tendencies. And naturally, she became the centerpiece of court gossip and subtle political maneuvering. Because nothing encourages intrigue quite like a queen who is both present and yet untouchable. Moving to France, we encounter Margaret of Provence, who married Louis IX. Now, Margaret wasn't locked behind bars in the dramatic sense, but her family's influence effectively restricted her movement and decisions for long stretches. She was under constant scrutiny, expected to adhere to her mother-in-law's strict household rules, and occasionally sidelined in courtly matters because her opinions were, well, inconvenient. Queens, even in relative comfort, could feel the invisible walls of expectation pressing upon them, a gentle form of imprisonment that weighed on the spirit more than the body. And then, of course, there's Catherine de' Medici, who, although better remembered as a formidable political operator, experienced periods of subtle confinement in her youth. She was closely monitored by her mother, noble guardians, and tutors, and her marriage to Henry II of France was arranged with a delicacy of political precision that left little room for personal choice. She was, in essence, a queen in training under careful watch, because every step she took might tip the balance of dynasties. The imprisonment was not literal, but it was a slow, pressing presence in her life, a reminder that royalty often came with invisible chains. Of course, confinement could be more physical and dramatic. Blanche of Castile, mother to Louis IX, wielded power as regent, but also enforced confinement on her daughter-in-law when political circumstances demanded it. A queen's body, even in a palace filled with courtiers and servants, could be the site of political strategy. Windows might open to the gardens, meals might arrive on delicate platters, but the doors were often locked, the guards vigilant, the freedom carefully rationed. In this way, imprisonment was as much a matter of psychological control as physical restraint. It's also worth noting that the treatment of imprisoned queens often combined dignity with absurdity. They were not tossed into dungeons with rats and darkness. No, they were given the trappings of court life. Silk gowns, fine linens, attentive attendants. And yet, they could not act freely. They were like ornaments in a grand hall, present but largely symbolic, their movements dictated by others, their choices subtly monitored. The contrast between luxury and restriction, between comfort and control, was at once cruel and almost comically bureaucratic. Sometimes the reasons were family politics. Siblings could be jealous, parents overbearing, children ambitious. Queens were, in a sense, pawns in chess games, their bodies and movements manipulated to suit dynastic ends. The imprisonment was rarely violent. It was a quiet, pervasive form of pressure, enforced with etiquette, household rules, and the careful management of servants. And naturally, the psychological effects were profound. Isolation could dull the senses, restrict personal growth, and leave a queen uncertain of her own influence. And yet many found ways to assert small forms of agency, subtle acts of rebellion, or private rituals that reminded them they were still alive, still thinking, still human. Let's drift over now to the English court again, to Anne Boleyn. She is more famous for her execution than her imprisonment, but it's worth noting that the months leading up to her downfall were a slow, careful confinement orchestrated by her own family, the king's court, and political rivals. She was allowed to walk, to receive visitors, to dress elegantly. But her freedom of movement and action was tightly controlled. Each day passed with meticulous observation, and her attendants became instruments of the state, reporting her words and deeds. It was a reminder that in royal life, even the luxurious trappings of queenship could mask very literal forms of imprisonment. And what did queens do with their days in confinement? Much like medieval nurses, they found ways to occupy themselves. Needlework, reading, writing letters, quiet prayers, and, naturally, plotting. Because if you are confined in gilded rooms, observed constantly, and restricted from your usual autonomy, a mind might wander. And it often did. Historians have preserved letters, marginal notes, and diary entries that reveal moments of irritation, humor, boredom, and subtle defiance. Even in imprisonment, queens retained small flickers of personality, small acts of autonomy that reminded their observers and themselves that they were, in essence, still alive and thinking. So, the story of queens imprisoned by their families is not one of swords or dramatic escapes, though those exist in some cases. It's a story of subtle control, of luxurious constraint, of lives contained by invisible and visible walls alike. It's about the quiet tension between power and restriction, about the peculiar irony of living in a palace yet being denied freedom, about the way human beings, especially ambitious, clever, and observant women, find ways to assert themselves even in the most tightly monitored circumstances. And in that way, these queens resemble us tonight, lying quietly, aware of limits, listening to the gentle rhythms of the world, thinking private thoughts that no one else can fully know. Their lives were shaped by walls and doors, by etiquette and observation, by political necessity and family ambition. But within those walls, they lived, they dreamed, they found ways to occupy themselves. They remind us that history is not only about battles and triumphs, but also about quiet endurance, small rebellions, and the human capacity to persist in constrained circumstances. Some convents, for example, maintained bathhouses and insisted on weekly washing. Certain monastic orders had elaborate rules about hand-washing before every prayer. And in Muslim Spain, hygiene was taken very seriously indeed. Medieval Islamic culture valued cleanliness as part of daily faith, and cities like Córdoba and Granada had sophisticated plumbing and public baths long before most of Europe had latrines. Travelers from Christian Europe sometimes wrote in astonishment about these cities, tiled, scented, and full of running water. It must have felt like stepping into another world. When men faced the witch's shadow. Hey, everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a world of narrow cobblestone streets, flickering torchlight, and the kind of quiet fear that seeps in when neighbors watch each other too closely. We usually think of witch trials as a distinctly female tragedy, a parade of accusations and interrogations aimed at women with herbs, sharp tongues, or simply the misfortune of being alive. But tonight, we're going to gently wander through the stories of men accused of witchcraft and the unusual punishments that awaited them. Now, the first thing to understand is that men accused of witchcraft often face the same suspicions as women, but with an added layer of societal awkwardness. Because, after all, it was considered slightly anomalous, almost ironic, for men who were supposed to be rational, strong, and slightly impervious to the supernatural, to be caught dabbling in spells, charms, or the dark arts. And when these men were accused, communities sometimes responded with methods that were quietly inventive, subtly cruel, or absurdly specific. Let's drift first to Germany in the late 16th century, where a man named Johann Georg was accused of making a pact with the devil. Now, Johann was a baker, which already complicates the story because flour, sugar, and dough can be interpreted as magical in certain circles, especially when the bread turns out strangely. Johann was not thrown into a fiery pit immediately, as dramatic as that might sound. Instead, his punishment began with a form of public shaming that would, by today's standards, feel both quaint and oddly bureaucratic. He was paraded through the village, his head covered in a paper cone listing his alleged crimes. The villagers were encouraged to jeer, but not to physically harm him yet. It was a punishment designed to embarrass, to isolate, and to remind the baker that his magic, real or imagined, was socially unacceptable. Then there was the curious practice of swimming a suspected male witch. Now, swimming was more often associated with women, but in rare cases, men faced it too. The logic was, if you floated, the devil had claimed you. If you sank, you were innocent, though perhaps drowned. In 17th century England, a man accused of causing a sudden illness in his neighbors was subjected to this aquatic trial. He was tied carefully, of course, because the community wasn't quite ready to fully lose him, and gently lowered into the river. The water did not judge him kindly. He floated just enough to send the villagers into a quiet frenzy of confirmation. He was then fined, whipped lightly, and exiled for a month, because naturally water alone was not enough punishment for someone suspected of negotiating with infernal powers. And then there were punishments that were, shall we say, more domestic in nature. In some Swiss villages, a man accused of witchcraft might be forced to wear a bell around his neck for days or weeks. The bell was intended to announce his presence, mark him as socially dangerous, and, subtly, to remind him that he was under constant observation. He could eat, sleep, and even walk through the village, but everyone knew where he was at all times. It was a punishment designed to be inconvenient, slightly humiliating, and psychologically taxing. A slow, rhythmic reminder that society had deemed him suspect. In France, certain male witches were confined to small cages or wooden stocks in public squares. Unlike dramatic executions, these were often temporary, lasting a few hours to a day, during which villagers could throw mud, rotten vegetables, or whisper threats. The goal was not necessarily death, but humiliation, a gentle social exorcism that combined punishment with spectacle. Men who were already heads of households or socially respected found this particularly ironic. One can imagine the discomfort of a prominent blacksmith forced to sit in a wooden cage while the villagers debated the alignment of his soul with cosmic malevolence. And naturally, some punishments reflected the specific nature of the alleged magic. In the Italian Alps, a man accused of bewitching livestock might be forced to walk barefoot over sharp stones, carry heavy sacks of hay, or endure long, tedious rituals of confession before he was even allowed to return home. These punishments were oddly practical. They were exhausting, uncomfortable, and symbolic, demonstrating control over his body while leaving the soul ostensibly untested. Villagers took great satisfaction in seeing him toil under these carefully measured indignities, and he learned slowly to avoid wandering too close to chickens, cows, or local herbs deemed suspicious. It's also worth noting that some punishments were essentially preventative. A man accused of witchcraft might be forced to swear oaths over holy water, carry charms, or participate in rituals meant to unbind his dangerous tendencies. In practice, these rituals often involved long hours of kneeling, chanting, or carrying awkward objects around the village. It was a punishment designed to blend social control with mild religious theater, a slow, hypnotic, and oddly calming ritual for everyone but the accused. And of course, confessions played a curious role. Male witches, when accused, were often interrogated under gentle or harsh conditions depending on the region. In some cases, torture was employed, though less systematically than for women. In others, men were allowed to negotiate minor confessions in exchange for small reductions in punishment. A blacksmith might admit to knowing a spell to heal a neighbor's cow or to curse a rival's goose and receive a lighter penalty. The irony, naturally, was that these confessions, coerced, exaggerated, or true, became evidence for further accusations. A subtle loop of social paranoia that could quietly consume months or years of a man's life. Let's drift to Scandinavia for a moment, where a man accused of sorcery might face a kind of occupational suspension. If he was a healer, barber, or herbalist, he could be forbidden to practice his trade for weeks or months. This was both punishment and prevention, because the community feared that if he continued his work, magical influence, real or imagined, might spread. In some villages, male witches were carefully watched, while performing otherwise ordinary tasks, such as tending animals or repairing roofs. The oversight was persistent but gentle, a reminder that society had control, even when violence was not required. And it's worth noting the subtle humor that sometimes emerged. Though it was quiet, understated, and often deeply ironic, men who were naturally timid, scholarly, or socially awkward were accused with particular relish, because their demeanor suggested a susceptibility to the dark arts. And when they were punished, the contrast between their scholarly demeanor and the humiliating tasks assigned, crawling through mud, wearing bells, parading in stocks, was quietly satisfying to the village, almost like a slow, understated comedy played out in real time. Of course, not every male witch faced public humiliation. Some were quietly confined at home, watched by family members, or restricted in their movements through subtle social pressures. They might be required to perform prayers, attend church regularly, or participate in supervised labor. The punishment was soft, prolonged, and psychologically effective. The subtlety of these constraints often made them far more enduring than a single dramatic execution, because the accused man lived with them daily, slowly internalizing the community's disapproval. And in some cases, the punishments were strangely bureaucratic. Records show men forced to appear before councils repeatedly, to answer the same questions, to recount the same stories, or to attend tedious inspections of property and tools. One could imagine the quiet, soul-numbing rhythm of days filled with hearings, oaths, and carefully monitored interactions. There was a kind of hypnotic dullness to it, an endless series of small, precise, and mildly humiliating events designed to reinforce the idea that one had strayed from acceptable boundaries of magical practice. In essence, the unusual punishments faced by men accused of witchcraft were rarely dramatic spectacles of death, though those existed. They were social, psychological, and occasionally absurd. They were slow, deliberate, and persistent. They involved humiliation, labor, ritual, and quiet monitoring. And they reflected, above all, a society deeply invested in controlling the unknown, the inexplicable, and the slightly awkward behaviors of men who were thought to flirt too closely with forbidden arts. So, as we imagine these men walking slowly through cobblestone streets, carrying heavy loads, wearing bells, or sitting quietly in cages while villagers whispered, we can sense the odd, low-energy rhythm of early modern justice. It was not about spectacle alone. It was about slow, careful assertion of order, of social hierarchy, and of communal reassurance. And the men, however unfortunate, endured. Some resisted, some adapted, and some simply survived, quietly bearing the peculiar burdens of accusation. And in that way, these stories resemble us tonight, lying quietly, aware of subtle restrictions, observing invisible rules, and pondering the gentle absurdities of life. The unusual punishments of male witches remind us that history is not always about dramatic heroics or tragic finales. Sometimes it is about small indignities, careful oversight, and the slow, persistent pressures of community. And there is, in that slow rhythm, a kind of hypnotic calm, a reminder that even the darkest fears of society are often expressed in the quietest, most measured ways.